London learned to look without seeing, and the season perfected that art until it could wound without touching. In drawing-rooms heavy with wax and rosewater, reputations were weighed as lightly as gloves and set aside with equal ease. It was in such a room, beneath a chandelier whose prisms multiplied every glance, that Eliza Hartwell learned how small a person might be made by politeness alone. She had arrived with the modest punctuality of one accustomed to being tolerated, not anticipated, and she wore a morning gown of dove-gray muslin that announced restraint rather than ambition. The fabric was clean, well-kept, and deliberately unadorned, as though she wished to reassure the world that she desired nothing it might begrudge her. Eliza's father had once possessed the comfort of an income that allowed him to forget accounts and believe the future benevolent. That illusion had collapsed with a bad investment and a lingering illness, leaving his daughter to inherit courtesy without protection. Gentle birth remained her passport, but it was stamped with uncertainty, and society examined it closely before allowing her passage. Invitations arrived thinly, if at all, and when they did, they carried the faint tone of obligation. She accepted them with gratitude that never quite reached her eyes, practicing the discipline of appearing unoffended. In such discipline, she had become adept, training her posture to calm and her voice to humility, lest confidence be mistaken for presumption. The townhouse belonged to the Duchess of Belhaven, whose name moved through rooms with the assurance of authority, even when she was absent. Eliza had been invited under the harmless promise of afternoon tea, a phrase that suggested civility while concealing judgment. She entered the drawing-room aware of her position before it was confirmed, chairs subtly angled away, conversations resumed without her, smiles bestowed as one might offer charity. She was neither insulted nor embraced, merely placed, like a book returned to the wrong shelf. Eliza seated herself where she was directed and folded her hands, schooling her expression into serene composure while her thoughts arranged themselves carefully, so as not to betray disappointment. The Duchess observed from a distance that seemed casual only to the untrained eye. Years of managing estates and alliances had sharpened her attention into a precise instrument, and she employed it now without mercy. She noted Eliza's manners, the absence of affectation, the steadiness with which she met indifference. Such qualities were not celebrated in the season, yet they endured. Around the room, whispers gathered, as they always did, attaching themselves to lineage and fortune, to the faint scent of vulnerability. The Duchess listened without appearing to listen, measuring risk against utility with the calm of a general surveying a field. Eliza poured her tea when the tray was passed, though no one else seemed inclined to drink. The porcelain warmed her fingers, and she welcomed the simple sensation, grounding herself in something honest. She wondered whether her father would have approved of her perseverance, whether he would have urged retreat instead. Pride and necessity wrestled within her, neither victorious. She did not look for admiration, only a place to stand without apology. The room continued its murmured evaluations, and she accepted them as whether unpleasant but inevitable. The Duke of Ashbourne was not present, yet his absence was felt as keenly as a held breath. His name hovered in conversation, attached to speculation and careful avoidance. Eliza had never met him, though she knew his outline as one knows a landmark glimpsed from a distance. He was spoken of as burdened and brilliant, a man whose inheritance carried obligations like ballast. Rumor suggested negotiations underway, alliances considered with the cold logic of survival. Eliza registered these fragments without curiosity, for such matters belonged to a sphere from which she had been gently excluded. The Duchess approached at last, her steps measured, her expression composed into something that resembled kindness. She seated herself beside Eliza with deliberate grace, altering the room's geometry by proximity alone. Conversation faltered, then rearranged itself at a safer distance. Eliza inclined her head, offering the respect expected, and waited. The Duchess spoke of trivialities first, of weather and roads, her voice a cultivated calm that suggested patience rather than delay. Eliza answered appropriately, her replies concise, revealing nothing beyond attentiveness. Then the Duchess leaned closer, and the air between them changed. The whisper that followed was not unkind, but it was urgent, edged with calculation refined by necessity. She explained, briefly and without apology, that circumstances required discretion and appearance in equal measure. An entail stood endangered, creditors attentive, relations restless. The Duke required time, and time required a shield. Eliza listened, her mind racing to assemble meaning without panic. The Duchess's gaze did not waver, as though daring refusal. "You must pretend to be my son's fiancée," the Duchess said softly, placing the words where only Eliza could hear them. There was no threat in the tone, only certainty. Eliza felt the room tilt, not with drama but with consequence. Acceptance promised scrutiny beyond endurance. Refusal promised disappearance. She considered her father's lessons, her own precarious standing, the narrow corridor left to her by circumstance. She met the Duchess's eyes and understood that this request was neither favor nor cruelty, but a transaction shaped by a world that valued surfaces over souls. In that instant, Eliza realized that her quiet endurance had prepared her for a role she had never sought, and that the cost of remaining unseen might be greater than the peril of being observed. She drew a breath measured enough to pass for calm, though her heart pressed hard against its limits. Whatever answer she gave would alter the narrow path she walked. Beyond the glass, carriages rolled on, indifferent. Within, the season waited. Eliza lowered her eyes, not in submission, but in thought, and prepared to speak, knowing silence itself had become a choice. The future listened, counting each breath as consent or refusal. Eliza accepted the role with a composure that surprised even herself, though it cost her a night without rest and a morning spent weighing every consequence. By noon the arrangement had begun its quiet work, reshaping how she was addressed, where she stood, and who now sought her attention. Servants inclined their heads more deeply, invitations followed with unnatural speed, and her name traveled ahead of her into rooms where it had never lingered before. She became, in the language of the season, a subject of interest rather than endurance. Yet the transformation brought no comfort, only vigilance, for every courtesy now carried examination, and each smile seemed sharpened by doubt. Eliza wore her new significance carefully, as one might carry glass across a crowded floor, aware that a single misstep would be noticed and remembered long after the fragments were cleared away. The Duke of Ashbourne arrived that evening beneath a sky bruised by impending rain, his carriage stopping with the finality of a decision long delayed. He entered the Duchess's townhouse not as a conqueror but as a man prepared for resistance, his expression disciplined into calm. Tall and spare, with a gravity that suggested thought rather than severity, he surveyed the drawing-room as though measuring what must be defended. When his gaze fell upon Eliza, he paused, and the pause carried weight. She rose, guided by instruction rather than impulse, and met him with the courtesy due a stranger elevated by rumor into necessity. The Duke bowed, his manner precise, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise, as if expectation had yielded to something unaccounted for. Introductions were made with the careful emphasis of a legal clause, binding without explanation. Eliza felt the words settle upon her shoulders, heavier than silk. She addressed him formally, offering nothing that might be mistaken for familiarity, while the Duchess observed with a satisfaction she did not attempt to hide. The Duke listened, his attention unbroken, and replied with restraint that bordered on kindness. He did not smile easily, but when he did, it seemed earned, the result of recognition rather than charm. Eliza sensed, with a tightening beneath her ribs, that he was not a man inclined toward illusion, and that made the deception between them feel suddenly precarious. Their first public appearance followed swiftly, engineered with the precision of a campaign. They entered a crowded salon together, her arm resting lightly upon his, the contact measured to suggest intimacy without excess. Conversation faltered, then surged, as eyes adjusted to the unexpected pairing. Eliza felt herself assessed anew, her gown, her posture, the angle of her head all scrutinized for legitimacy. The Duke moved beside her with an attentiveness that seemed instinctive, placing himself between her and inquiry, offering his name as shield. When he spoke, others listened, and when he deferred to her, the gesture altered her standing more decisively than any declaration. Tokens began to appear, discreet yet deliberate. A small volume of poetry arrived the next morning, its flyleaf blank, its choice revealing discernment rather than display. At a musicale, the Duke stood when she entered, an action so understated it escaped notice until its absence would have been remarked. During a promenade, he offered his arm without waiting for invitation, his touch brief, respectful, and strangely grounding. Eliza accepted these gestures with care, aware that each carried consequence beyond its simplicity. Gratitude mingled with unease, for she could not tell where obligation ended and intention began. Whispers followed, quickening in their pursuit. Some questioned her lineage, others her fortune, a few her motives. Eliza learned to recognize the tone of skepticism masked as curiosity, and she bore it with practiced serenity. The Duke, when informed, did not immediately refute the rumors, choosing instead a silence that unsettled her. She wondered whether his restraint served strategy or doubt, and the uncertainty pressed upon her with unwelcome intimacy. Yet when they were alone, briefly, in the anteroom before supper, he spoke to her with an honesty that surprised them both, acknowledging the artifice without apology and promising discretion without false reassurance. The Duchess watched their interactions with a calculating eye, pleased and wary in equal measure. She understood better than most how easily a fiction might overgrow its purpose. The season responded as it always did, magnifying what it could not comprehend, and Eliza found herself walking a narrow line between acceptance and exposure. As the evening concluded, the Duke offered his arm once more, and she took it, aware that the room now perceived them as singular. The rain began at last, striking the windows with quiet insistence, and Eliza felt, beneath the measured calm of appearances, the first true tremor of risk. The rain that delayed them was unremarkable by London standards, yet it altered the evening with decisive force. Carriages stalled, schedules dissolved, and the Duke's plan to escort Eliza home dissolved into necessity rather than intention. They waited in a narrow withdrawing room, lit by a single lamp whose flame shivered each time the wind pressed against the windows. The house settled around them, servants moving quietly elsewhere, leaving a pocket of stillness that neither had anticipated. Eliza stood near the mantel, her gloves folded in her hands, aware that the space between them felt larger than the room itself. The Duke remained by the window, listening to the rain with a concentration that suggested refuge as much as delay. Silence pressed, not awkward but expectant. Eliza had mastered the art of silence in company, yet this quiet demanded response. She spoke first, her voice low, acknowledging the inconvenience and apologizing for the trouble, as though circumstance were a personal failing. The Duke turned, his expression thoughtful rather than reproachful, and assured her that inconvenience was preferable to haste. The words were courteous, but the manner in which he said them invited something more candid. She sensed the invitation and hesitated, weighing propriety against the urgency that had begun to stir within her since the deception took form. She confessed, carefully, that the role required more courage than she had anticipated. She spoke of scrutiny, of being seen too clearly and not clearly enough, of the strain of wearing significance like borrowed jewelry. The Duke listened without interruption, his attention undivided, his posture open in a way she had not yet witnessed. When she finished, she felt exposed yet lighter, as though truth, even partial, relieved its own burden. He responded not with reassurance but with acknowledgment, admitting that he had underestimated the cost to her, believing the fiction simpler than reality allowed. The admission altered something fundamental. Eliza moved from the mantel to the chair nearest the lamp, the light revealing the tension she had maintained with such discipline. The Duke followed, stopping at a respectful distance, yet closer than before. He spoke then of his inheritance, not as privilege but as obligation, describing the weight of expectations that shaped every decision. He revealed that silence had long been his refuge, that choosing nothing felt safer than choosing wrongly. Eliza recognized the sentiment with a shock of recognition, understanding that their restraint mirrored each other's caution. As the rain softened, so did their conversation. Words gathered courage, forming confessions neither had intended to make. Eliza admitted her fear that when the season ended, so would her usefulness, and that she would be set aside without ceremony. The Duke answered with an honesty that startled them both, confessing that he feared the same ending, not for convenience lost but for something rarer. He did not name it, but the implications settled between them, fragile and undeniable. The lamp's flame steadied, casting shadows that softened their features and lent the moment a gentleness the world beyond rarely permitted. They spoke of boundaries then, of what must remain unsaid, of the necessity of restraint. Each sentence carried the weight of what it avoided. The Duke's voice lowered, not with passion but with care, as he promised that she would not be dismissed lightly, that he would not permit her dignity to be compromised by his needs. Eliza believed him, not because of the promise itself, but because of the effort it cost him to make it. She felt an unexpected warmth bloom, tempered by the knowledge that warmth invited pain. A knock sounded, distant yet decisive, reminding them of the world waiting beyond the door. The moment contracted, urgency replacing reflection. Before parting, the Duke reached into his pocket and produced a letter, sealed but unmarked, explaining that it concerned the entail and that its contents were troubling. He did not open it, offering instead its presence as warning rather than disclosure. Eliza understood that the fiction they shared had begun to attract attention sharper than gossip. She accepted the knowledge with a calm she did not feel, nodding as though uncertainty were an old acquaintance. When the rain ceased and the carriage was called, they resumed their public composure with practiced ease. Yet as Eliza stepped into the night, she carried with her the echo of their conversation, aware that something irrevocable had begun. The deception had deepened into understanding, and understanding into longing restrained by honor. As the carriage moved away, she looked back once, seeing the Duke framed in lamplight, his expression unreadable yet intent. The season resumed its measured pace, unaware that its most careful fiction had begun to demand truth, and that the cost of silence would soon exceed the risk of speech. The challenge came not with spectacle but with formality, delivered in the dry language of obligation that left no room for misunderstanding. It arrived as an invitation bearing seals too heavy to ignore, summoning the Duke to a gathering where alliances would be discussed openly and intentions forced into daylight. Eliza learned of it from the Duchess, whose composure remained intact even as calculation sharpened her gaze. The fiction had served its purpose, the Duchess explained, but now it demanded either confirmation or dissolution, and the season would accept no ambiguity. Eliza listened with a steadiness earned through endurance, understanding that the hour had arrived when usefulness must yield to consequence. She prepared herself to withdraw. It seemed the only honorable course, preserving what dignity remained and freeing the Duke to choose safety without constraint. In her chamber she laid out her plainest gown, the one she had worn before significance found her, and felt a quiet resolve settle. The borrowed prominence had been costly, but it had taught her the measure of her own strength. She would not beg, nor would she linger as a reminder of risk. When she descended to the drawing-room, her manner was composed, her intention clear, and the Duchess received her with a look that suggested both respect and regret. The Duke arrived shortly after, his presence altering the room with a gravity that could not be ignored. He greeted them both, his attention lingering on Eliza with an intensity that unsettled her resolve. She spoke first, explaining her decision with calm precision, assuring him that her withdrawal would be framed as mutual convenience rather than rejection. The words sounded reasonable, even generous, yet they tasted of loss. The Duke listened, his expression unreadable, and for a moment Eliza feared she had misjudged him entirely. Then he spoke, not to refuse but to ask her to remain, at least until the gathering concluded, his tone carrying a weight that suggested more than courtesy. That evening unfolded beneath chandeliers bright enough to expose every doubt. The assembly was formidable, filled with relations and interested parties whose smiles concealed strategy. Eliza stood beside the Duke, aware that this appearance might be her last, and she resolved to meet scrutiny with grace rather than hope. Questions were posed, politely sharp, circling the nature of their engagement and the intentions behind it. The Duke answered with restraint, deflecting without confirming, until the pressure became unmistakable. Silence stretched, inviting capitulation. It was then that he spoke with clarity that silenced the room. He acknowledged the arrangement's beginnings without shame, naming necessity where others had whispered opportunism. He declared that necessity had revealed something unexpected, that in the woman beside him he had found constancy rather than convenience. His voice did not rise, nor did it plead, yet it carried the authority of decision. Eliza felt the room tilt again, not with peril but with recognition. He did not speak of love, but of choice, of honor freely given rather than required, and the distinction mattered more than any declaration she had imagined. Murmurs followed, but they lacked force. The Duchess watched, her composure breaking only enough to reveal relief tempered by surrender. The entail, the creditors, the alliances all shifted in response to resolve openly claimed. Eliza stood silent, her heart unsteady, aware that her life had altered irrevocably in the space of a few sentences. When the gathering concluded, the Duke offered his arm, not as performance but as promise, and she accepted, her hand light yet certain. Later, in the quiet that followed departure, they spoke again, briefly, without audience. He told her that he would not bind her without consent freely given, that the choice he claimed must be hers as well. Eliza answered with truth she no longer feared, admitting that she had learned courage from the risk itself, and that she would not retreat from what had grown between them. The words were simple, yet they settled like vows unspoken. The season did not end that night, but its judgment had softened. Eliza walked away from the townhouse beside the Duke, not triumphant, but assured. Carriages rolled on, indifferent as ever, yet she felt no urge to look back. The future remained uncertain, shaped by duty and consequence, but it no longer excluded her. In choosing visibility over safety, they had claimed something rarer than approval, and as dawn approached, the city seemed briefly to hold its breath, acknowledging a union formed not by design alone, but by deliberate will.